Ukraine has asked for help from its European neighbours following a massive Russian airstrike. In Kyiv, these residents sheltered in a subway as a series of explosions sounded in the capital. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the missile and drone bombardment was one of the largest of the war. The airstrikes hit energy facilities in some regions, disrupting power and water supplies. Straight to the Ukrainian capital then. We can join our correspondent Nick Connolly. Welcome, Nick. What more can you tell us?
So the air alert that basically was in place for almost 8 hours, which is unusually long, has just finished. So that was going on since early morning. Kind of mid-morning here, the windows in Kyiv were shaking. You could really feel the force of the air defences, those missiles going in to intercept Russian ballistic missiles heading towards Kyiv. That was something we haven't seen for weeks now. Basically, the last major Russian attack of its kind was early July when that children's hospital was destroyed. That was the last time that Russia had the capacity to do this. I think the fact that Russia is having to send in 100 missiles at a time basically tells you that Ukraine's air defences are a lot better than they were. They just can't get past Ukraine's defences if they send smaller numbers at a time, and basically now they're having to wait until their stocks are rebuilt. Once the conveyor belts have kind of produced enough, they can then once every month or every 6 weeks send in a new party of missiles. But it's notably wide-ranging this time around. 15 of Ukraine's regions have been affected, more than half, basically all across the country, from Kharkiv in the east to Odessa in the south, here Kyiv and further west affected. Lots of people still without power. And I think basically, the numbers still are unclear how many people have suffered, but this was very big, and I think people are expecting those casualty numbers to rise. And I think where this leads us politically is we're going to have Volodymyr Zelensky saying once again to the West, look, when you gave me the permission to use Western weapons against Russian targets 100 kilometers inside Russia, cities like Kharkiv have had a much better time since people have been returning, normalizing life. For life across Ukraine to be functional, to be realistic, we need the capacity and the permission to attack the air bases in Russia, sometimes hundreds of miles away from the border that the planes that launch these attacks fly from. And, we've had lots of reluctance from Western countries to escalate this, but the Ukrainians will be saying, look, we went into Russia properly, we went into the Kursk region. Vladimir Putin's red lines don't mean very much, so give us this capacity. Otherwise, trying to intercept every single missile is a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult than dealing with this problem at source.
Thanks for that, Nick. DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Well, as you heard Nick saying there, Volodymyr Zelensky has renewed his call for Western allies to lift restrictions on his country's use of the long-range weapons they've provided. As Ukrainian attacks across the Russian border continue, the US and several European countries who've provided tens of thousands of advanced guided missiles have also restricted their use to Russian targets near the Ukrainian border. While President Zelensky lobbies for these restrictions to be lifted, Ukraine's also building its own guided missiles in the hope of one day becoming self-sufficient.
Kyiv, April 2022. A Russian strike on a factory that produces one of the most hard-to-get weapons for Ukraine, guided missiles. A government website says the plant has been rebuilt and continues to manufacture guided missiles for the homegrown Vilka multiple rocket launcher. The Vilka uses this R-624 missile with a range of up to 130 kilometers, about 2 to 3 times further than an artillery shell. The bigger prize, however, is the missile next to it, the Neptune guided cruise missile that can hit targets 200 kilometers away and even further with modifications. In December, Kyiv announced that they would be ramping up production of the Neptune, but did not give any more details. Ukraine once produced 30% of the Soviet Union's weapons, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did Ukraine's defense industry. Since the full-scale Russian invasion began, Ukraine has managed to regrow its defense industry, producing artillery shells and a bewildering amount of drones. But in one vital area, Ukraine is way behind Russia, the production of guided missiles. At the end of July, President Volodymyr Zelensky said this might be changing.
Our missile program is showing good dynamics, and although it is a challenging task, we are gradually approaching the possibility of using our own missiles, and not just relying on missiles supplied by our partners.
The current state of Ukraine's domestic missile production is a government secret. The ultimate goal is to manufacture state-of-the-art guided missiles like the US-supplied ATACMS. They're precise and hard to shoot down because of their sophisticated guidance system. And importantly, they can hit targets 300 kilometers deep into Russia. Or they could, but their range is limited by the US. Zelensky has long called for the ability to launch guided missiles across the Russian border.
It would be possible to stop this Russian terror if we could provide our military with adequate missiles. Then the terrorists would not have a sense of impunity. Ukraine needs long-range missiles in particular to remove the possibility of the occupier placing its missile launchers far from the front line and destroying Ukrainian cities with them.
The US and other Western allies have since eased restrictions to allow attacks on Russian military objects near the Ukrainian border, such as bridges in Russia's Kursk region, which Ukraine says it hit with US-made HIMARS rockets. But if Ukraine can produce its own guided missiles at scale, they wouldn't have any constraints. And perhaps more importantly, the missiles wouldn't stop coming if allies stopped sending them. The goal of self-reliance may still be a long way off, despite Zelensky's reassurances. Some analysts say it could take over a decade for Ukraine to ramp up production enough to be able to defend itself without Western help.
Well, let's pick up some of those points with Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, Alexander Kamyshin. Welcome to DW, Minister. Can we start with that last point raised in our report? How long do you anticipate it'll take Ukraine to become self-sufficient in weapons production?
Hello, nice to meet you. At this point, indeed, we are ramping up local production, but already for almost a year, we've been facing scarce deficit of local government funding. Because again, the capabilities to produce are almost 3 times higher than funding available. In this respect, I would be always grateful to Denmark for being the leader in the new initiative, which is called Zbroyery. That's the name for Ukrainian armorers. And with this initiative, we got external funding. The first one came from Denmark, from Danish government. And it's going to procure from Ukrainian manufacturers and donate to Ukrainian army. With this help, we can scale up faster because, as I told you, our capabilities are higher than the funding available.
Right. So, to put it simply, if you had more money, you have the capacity to produce more weapons, and it's just a lack of money that is holding you back.
Definitely. Definitely.
And looking at the politics of this, especially following Russia's overnight missile attack against your country, it must be very frustrating for the Ukrainian government as Russia rains down missiles on your country to be told by your allies, no, you may not use the weapons that we gave you to hit back at targets in Russia.
In my domain in defense industry, we are struggling to produce more and more. Once we get more funding, we would be capable to produce much more. And then these discussions about the allowance to strike deep inside Russia was made outside of Ukraine weapon systems would go away. We already showed that we can reach Russia deep inside with things made in Ukraine. You know that almost all operations which we have on the territory in Russia use Ukrainian weapon and artillery systems, and that gives the result.
Last week, President Zelensky announced that Ukraine had completed the development of a long-range drone missile called Palyanitsia. He seemed very excited about it. Why?
First of all, that's the first-in-class product, the rocket drone. Second, we got the first successful application. And third, that's fully locally designed and manufactured. And that's the first one to go. Others will follow, and you will see how much it can make.
Fully locally designed and manufactured, but I understand that Palyanitsia still needs outside help and technical support.
Well, definitely there are some components coming from outside, but the design and the full manufacturing comes from Ukraine.
OK, so I just want to press you on this, because the outside help that I'm talking about is you having to ask Elon Musk for permission to use the Starlink internet coverage to actually fly and guide your weapon. That must also be very frustrating for you.
I will not comment that.
Fair enough. Let's talk then about what happened overnight, this massive Russian attack against Ukrainian infrastructure. Are you confident that you will soon be able to stop these attacks, or at least force Russia to launch them from further away?
I'm responsible for defense industry. The only thing I can tell is that they shell defense industry factories regularly. They shell us roughly twice a week. So we get used to regular shelling, and we get used to how we can keep running even under shelling.
Let me turn to President Zelensky's comments on social media. He called on Western countries to uphold the commitments we've made together, in particular regards to air defence systems and missiles for them. Beyond that, he said, we must finally unite in our efforts to shoot down Russian missiles and drones. Is your president really calling on NATO countries to engage directly with Russia?
That's something you should ask from my president.
Presumably, though, this is something that you would support.
We would definitely support all the efforts that will make our sky clean.
In the same social media post, President Zelensky also wrote that across Ukraine, we could do much more to protect lives if the aviation of our European neighbours operated in concert with our F-16s and air defence systems. Explain to us what the President wants European countries to do that they are not already doing.
That's something you should ask from my president.
OK, so as far as you're concerned, that's all for him in terms of the politics and the Ukraine's offensive capability. You're just about the defence production. Well, we thank you for being as candid as you've been able to be. Alexander Kamyshin, Ukrainian Minister of Strategic Industries. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Frank Ledwidge lectures in strategic studies at Portsmouth University. He was a British military intelligence officer and is a regular on DW News. Frank, will Ukraine be able to produce enough missiles of its own to make a difference now?
Good morning, Ben. Well, as Nick said there, you cannot underestimate the Ukrainians with respect to this kind of technology. Before the war, they were certainly within the top 10 world space powers because of this expertise they had in building rockets, missiles, and such like. So two things there. First of all, just by way of indicator or illustration, Elon Musk's favorite rocket, apart from his own, is the Zenit, made in Ukraine. The Neptune missile that you saw there, the cruise missile that on Nick's report, let's not forget it was that sank the Moskva early on. They've been planning this now for 2 years, actually since before. I'm talking about the industrial policy behind this program. And they're clearly now producing results. For example, only late last week, you may have heard of strikes on Voronezh. Now, those were carried out by a hybrid drone missile, a bit like the Iranian and Russian Geran, the Shahid we hear a lot about, but driven this one by turbojets. So they're trying to balance speed, range, and payload very successfully. And that's a homegrown item.
Is that jet-propelled one?
That,
can I just ask you a question about that? Is that the type of thing that would allow Ukraine to strike even deeper into Russia without having to rely on its allies or get permission from its allies to strike targets within Russia?
Yes, absolutely. And developments from that. It's relatively, it's not primitive at all. What they're trying to do is develop things that they can produce at scale. So, yes, I've every confidence the Ukrainians in due course will be able to develop this kind of production line and those kinds of capabilities. The constraint, though, will be on the strikes that they sustain on those factories. They are being helped by the West, however, and I think that will offset it. So, yes, I think they can do this.
But will the West also allow Ukraine to use their weapons then, Western weapons, to strike deeper into Russia as well?
Yeah, and the key thing, only over the weekend, Zelensky asked once again for the use, or rather the permission to use in metropolitan Russia, in the sort of bigger part of Russia, the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles. Two constraints on that, I think. First is the number of missiles the West has, Britain and France in that case. And the second is I think they're genuinely concerned about Russia responding and retaliating, not by attacking Western soil, but by taking down NATO drones in the Black Sea, which would tend to blind assistance to Ukraine. So they are genuinely concerned about what the Russian response might be to that.
OK, we see Zelensky talking there. He says Ukraine is making small advances in Kursk. Where's that going? Where is Ukraine at right now?
Yeah, there's no doubt that Ukraine's advances in the Kursk sector are slowing down. I think the front is beginning to stabilise there. Russians are putting forces in. But look, the key centre of gravity here since the start and continuing today, tomorrow and for the next few months is that southeastern front, particularly before Pokrovsk and only over the weekend, Toretsk. So we need to watch those very carefully. And we have to remember that forces defending those areas were pulled away to conduct the Kursk offensive. And I think troops down there in the southeast will be asking themselves, is this a good trade? Because Russia has not taken the bait of withdrawing forces from those crucial sectors to try and push Ukrainian forces back in Kursk, Ben.
So what are you saying? Is Kursk more of a sideshow?
I would not put it quite like that. I think it's a gamble by the Ukrainians, and there are many good reasons for them doing it, but it's a gamble that relies on the Russians taking that bait of pulling back forces, of trading political loss for territorial gain, because obviously it's politically damaging. I suspect what Putin has done is, you know what, we'll take the political damage, we'll push this aspect of our country being invaded, and we'll press on the main effort. It's important to remember the first principle of war, selection and maintenance of the aim. And right now, the aim of the Russian forces is not to retake land, it's to head towards Pokrovsk.
You heard it from Frank Ledwidge. Thank you very much for the insights.
Thank you, Ben.